A quarter century after the collapse of the Soviet Union and democracy's apparent triumph over communism, many observers today see a crisis of confidence unsettling democracies around the world. How deep is that crisis, and what does it portend for 21st century liberal democracies? Jennifer Welsh tackles this set of issues as the 2016 CBC Massey Lecturer. It's in her series, The Return of History, Conflict, Migration, and Geopolitics in the 21st Century. She is professor and chair in international relations at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, and a fellow of Somerville College, University of Oxford. And Jennifer Welsh joins us now. It's so good to meet you finally, in person, after all these years. I want to start with the title because The Return of History suggests that history went off somewhere and hid and is now coming back. And if that's the case, where's it been?
Well, it's really a rip off of the idea of the end of history, which was Francis Fukuyama's prediction at the end of the Cold War, that history would, at least as he defined history, would be transcended. We'd moved past it. And so the return of history suggests that maybe not quite, and that it has come back in a variety of forms.
For those who don't remember the Fukuyama essay, which I think had a question mark at the end of it.
It did.
Shall we remind them? Here we go. Sheldon, if you would, roll the clip, please.
For the previous 150 years, most progressive intellectuals believed that there was this thing called history. That is to say, a progressive evolution of human societies. And the Marxist ones believed that there was an end of history which would be some form of a communist utopia. And my simple observation back in the winter of '88, '89 was it didn't look like we were going to get there. And in fact, given the trends going on in the Soviet Union and China and other places, it looked like history would terminate or evolve not into communism, but the penultimate stage, which would be some version of liberal democracy and a market economy. And I continue to believe that that argument is fundamentally right. I actually believe that there is such a thing as history in this Marxist Hegelian sense. We don't use that word anymore. We use terms like modernization or development, as in the U.S. Agency for International Development. But it basically means the same thing. It means that human societies have gone through a coherent process of transition from one type of political and social and economic organization to another. And the question is, where is that process headed?
Do you think there is a problem with Professor Fukuyama's claim that liberal democracies is where it's at?
I do, in two senses. One is that we've seen over the last 5 to 8 years a democratic recession, a decline in the number and the quality of democracies, and the erosion of liberal democratic values. So rather than the march forward, we've seen a regression. And secondly, the international dimension of his prognosis, that with the development of a liberal democracy, we would see more peace, more cooperation. Again, we've seen bumps on the road. And I guess it's a question of perspective, because he would argue, well, in the long run, I'll still be right. And then, of course, you can't expect things to happen overnight. But what I want to suggest in the book is that it's more than bumps in the road. And part of the reason for that is the crisis in liberal democracy itself.
Well, in the long run, we're all dead, as somebody once famously said. But in the short run, how do you know he's not right? I mean, it is fair to say that with all of the cataclysmic change over the past quarter century, you've got to expect a few bumps in the road somewhere, but in the long arc of history, he will be proved to be correct. Why is that not for sure?
Well, I can't say for sure that he's wrong. But I do question the idea that the liberal democratic model will necessarily be replicated in the same way and will result in the kind of peaceful relations that he predicts. I also think that the triad of qualities that he talks about as being at the heart of liberal democracy, so democratic government, respect for human rights, and an economic system with modern state oversight, is experiencing some pretty fundamental strain. I do agree with him, and here I show my cards, that I do think liberal democracy is the most admirable form of political system, but I'm much less complacent about its eventual triumph, partly because I think complacency is not good for us.
I'm not sure he'd share your use of the word complacency there. He might say confidence.
Yes, overconfidence, however we might play it, because I think then, and what we've seen, is an overconfidence in the ability of our system to weather these crises.
Well, you go even further than that. I think if I've got the quote right here, you say, I'm more of a Chicken Little when it comes to liberal democracy's future. Chicken Little, of course, famously saying, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. So what does a falling sky look like in your eyes?
Well, I think a lot of my perspective is driven by the fact that I have spent the last 3 to 5 years of my life focused on those areas of the world where there is conflict, where there is underdevelopment, and conflict of a particularly brutal kind. So if you look at the world in this kind of macro picture and you say most of us are at peace, and even Steven Pinker, the cognitive scientist, would say, well, but the places where there isn't peace are very brutal indeed. And I think that's what has given me my Chicken Little perspective. But the second dimension, and I think this is important, is that I'm very worried about the trends in liberal democracy itself. And looking back, as the book does at the beginning, at liberal democracy's trajectory from the late 1800s onwards, shows you that its progress was very uneven. It reversed. It was not inevitable that we had liberal democracies.
Okay, but I appreciate your concern about it, but almost every immigrant and or refugee in the world would give their eye teeth to move to a democracy today if they could. That does tell you something, doesn't it?
Yes. About its attractiveness as a political ideal, absolutely. And that's why I say in the book, that's the interesting position we find ourselves in. There is, unlike during the Cold War, and here Fukuyama is partly right, no viable universal alternative. And I think it impresses upon us the need to do more to reform, improve, and really shore up our liberal democracies.
Let me pick up on the refugee issue because obviously a quarter century ago, talk about the Berlin Wall coming down, something that those of us of a certain age could never have imagined happening in our lifetime, and yet it did. And now we live in a very different time where, of course, one of the candidates for president of the United States is talking about building a very big wall, and where other countries in Europe are talking about trying to build, if not literal, then at least metaphorical walls to keep the refugees out. What kind of a challenge does the current refugee crisis, in your view, pose for liberal democracies?
A very significant one. It's the challenge of our time, first of all, because I believe we have to stop referring to it as a crisis, which gives you this sense of a temporary blip.
It's a new normal?
It is a new normal. Mass flight is a function of our modern world, partly because the reasons for it are so diverse. They relate not just to war and persecution, which of course was at the origins of the Refugee Convention, but also fleeing extreme poverty, fleeing the effects of climate change, fleeing instability in a country. We now have, through technology, and you mentioned the Berlin Wall, an ability to see how the other half lives. And it only stands to reason that you will try to move if you believe you can have a better life. And it places great strain on those liberal democracies that claim to be unable to absorb that kind of movement.
Let's follow up on this then. I guess many people fear that too many refugees coming from too many Muslim societies want what the capitalist liberal democracies have, but not necessarily what they are, namely equality of the genders, equality of rights, freedom of speech, all of those individual freedoms and so on. Are the fears of those people justified about what too many Muslims into these societies could portend?
I don't think so. I think the fears need to be taken seriously. They need to be addressed. We need to engage in a dialogue. But I think what we can see, although the trajectory isn't perhaps a century long, is societies that have been able to take, at various points in time, refugees and immigrants of that particular faith, of that particular, in some cases, political belief system, and yet we haven't seen the complete breakdown of our society. Canada is one such place. Now, that is not to minimize the very real challenges that places. And so what we're seeing, particularly in Europe today, is micro examples of where those differences have become so apparent, really inflaming both sentiments among the population, but also the political rhetoric.
Well, this next question is one of those what-if questions that I think people who do what you do for a living kind of enjoy kicking over. So let's try this. Do you think the refugee crisis today in the world would be as massively significant as it is had the West responded more forcefully with what's happening in Syria years ago?
Yeah, it's an interesting counterfactual. I do think you rightly suggest that there's a cost to inaction. And I think there has been a narrative that has built up since Iraq, since Afghanistan, even since Libya in 2011, that action is too costly. It's costly both for Western societies in terms of their militaries, but also it's costly for those on the receiving end. But what there hasn't been a recognition of is the cost of inaction. And so what we have seen through a failure to resolve a protracted conflict is a number of very tricky consequences. The conflict has metastasized into so many different factions. And also what's really worrying is an almost resignation that there are certain conflicts that can't be solved. This just has to smolder, and we can't actually resolve it.
Well, Ed Lipwak says that all the time. These, you know, they got to burn themselves out, right? They've just got to fight and kill lots of people until they're tired of killing each other.
Yeah, and I don't believe that. I think that conflicts can be resolved. There obviously has to be the right moment, the right political pressure, the right political will, but it is a deeply worrying feature of our discourse right now that this idea that inaction carries no cost. We need to resist that. And instead, when we're thinking about the points at which third parties might act, of course, assessing what the consequences might be as best you can, especially the negative consequences.
You've had a role with the United Nations, yes?
Yes.
What have you been doing with them?
So for 3 years, I was special advisor to the Secretary General on a political principle known as the responsibility to protect, which is to protect populations from genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and also crimes against humanity.
It's sort of a Canadian idea, isn't it?
Sort of, yes. There are Canadian fingerprints on its origins.
Yeah, we were one of the original champions of that. What have you learned about the difference between democratic and not democratic countries regarding their willingness to protect victims of violence?
I don't think that you can necessarily cut it that way. I think we have, and the responsibility to protect shows this, actually a global consensus that cuts across political systems, parts of the world, that there are certain acts which are, by their very nature, criminal. They're international crimes. And so every state and government has expressed its adherence to the principle. Yet at the same time, as you rightly note, we've had instances where these crimes have been committed. But I don't think it falls into the democratic, non-democratic camp. I've seen a variety of different types of state engage in this type of violence. And I've also seen all kinds of states try to be part of the solution in thinking through how do you build inclusive societies? How do you actually prevent the negative dynamics that might give rise to, in some cases, very barbaric acts?
So just so I'm clear, the assumption, of course, is that we in the liberal democracies care more about individual victims of potential violence and are therefore more likely to care about and interject ourselves to prevent that from happening. You say that that's not the case?
Well, you're right that we've been at the forefront in many instances of efforts to create law and norms around this. And I also think that Western governments and Western militaries, if we're talking about war crimes, from a training point of view, from a doctrine point of view, have often been at the leading edge of trying to hold to a high standard. In practice, we've seen a variety of types of results. And what I try to say in the book, and I think this is really important to keep in mind in our present context, is that those who are, if you will, breaking the law today, in terms of the law I'm talking about, are not just non-state actors like Islamic State. They're also governments. We can't push this all to the side and say it's the nasty extremists, they're the only ones engaging in this kind of behavior. There are also governments that are supporting, either directly or indirectly, these kinds of situations.
Name names.
Well, I think Syria is an example. I think Yemen is an example where we either have governments directly participating or supporting parties to these conflicts, where there's been documented war crimes.
Where would you put Canada's being prepared to sell billions of dollars of arms to Saudi Arabia on that list?
I'd see it as a pretty problematic decision because Canada is a signatory to the Arms Trade Treaty. There is a provision in the Arms Trade Treaty about precisely the use of weapons in these kinds of circumstances, and if you know there is a risk that they might be used to commit violations of international humanitarian law, you have an obligation to cease. And so I think it was a very questionable decision.
You want to be the one to go to London, Ontario and tell all those hundreds of workers there that are out of work because...
I know, but these are the hard decisions. And I think also if your rhetoric is going to support these kinds of principles, then the decisions become particularly hard, but that's what leadership is.
I think we need to understand better one of these alternative models to liberal democracy, which you talk about, sovereign democracy. What is that?
Sovereign democracy is a Russian idea. And it's an idea that I think is extremely interesting because it is a part validation of Fukuyama and a part refutation. It's a validation in the following sense, that because, as you and I discussed a moment ago, there isn't a big viable alternative to liberal democracy on the world stage in the way that there was during the Cold War. There was communism. We have states using the idea of democracy to legitimize what they are, what they do. But the Russian word in front, the adjective sovereign democracy, reflects the idea that what's wrong with liberal democracy today as a model, particularly in the West, is that it's being pushed in a very dogmatic way, that all states should look the same. And the Russian argument through sovereign democracy is that there needs to be a variety of roads to this, a variety of ways of being democratic, and that particularly nations like Russia with a strong history, a strong tradition, need to pursue their own path. And I have to say, there is some support for this idea, but I wouldn't call it a universal alternative.
We had a fellow named Alexander Dugan on this program not too long ago talking about this very idea that liberal democracy may be okay for some, but Russians choose to interpret their form of democracy differently. Let's play a clip of the conversation we had with him, then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
There are many positive aspects in the West, but the one thing that everybody in the world, except maybe the West itself, hates, it is the way of imposing the values as something universal. So I think that this time it is a kind of lesson to teach to the West, to the Western civilization, that there can exist, that there can be positive other that shouldn't be judged by the Western patterns and should be acknowledged as something other that doesn't is the same or lesser or worse than the Western culture.
Do you think Mr. Dugan is right that liberal democracies is a fine idea for the West, but not for everyone?
Not necessarily. I think what's problematic about what he's suggesting is that it's impossible to still make judgments about political systems. And he's right that there are democratic elements in Russian society, but I think it is legitimate to ask questions about how certain universal notions, and I'm talking here about human rights, might be infringed. And I would say that not just about Russia, but I would say it about other parts of the world. We have in the UN system, in Geneva, the Universal Periodic Review, where every state, this is the strength of that system, at a certain point in time goes before the process and reports on its human rights, takes questions, responds. And so I think it remains legitimate to ask questions about whether human rights are being infringed. So I by no means want to accept the idea that certain liberal principles that are rights are not necessarily applicable elsewhere.
But I think part of his point is that what we call universal rights, he thinks of as Western rights, and the Russians, thank you very much, are a proud civilization that's lasted a very long time without necessarily embracing those rights, and we're every bit as legitimate as you are. You see that?
Oh yes, I understand that that's the argument.
Do you share his argument, is I guess what I'm saying.
No, in the following sense, that I think there are certain basic rights that we do have as part of the Universal Declaration that are also embraced, by the way, in countries outside of the West, in Asia, for example, in parts of Africa, where there is agreement. And so I think what he's touching on are more those sets of rights that really cut to the heart of political power around the right to free assembly, to oppose, a free media. Those are where we've seen over the last decade steps back in Russia.
And not only, well, I shouldn't say steps.
And not just in Russia.
And I was going to say, not steps back necessarily in China, because I'm not sure those steps were ever forward to begin with. However, let's do another clip here. Chinese political scientist Zhang Weiwei explaining why the Chinese also don't particularly care for this notion of liberal democracy. Sheldon, again, if you would.
Despite some of its known strengths, liberal democracy as an institution has been seriously eroded by such prevailing problems such as short-termism, single-minded populism, the excessive influence of money, especially in the United States, $1, one vote, and the influence of special interests. Abraham Lincoln's idea of government of the people, by the people, for the people, is hardly achievable among liberal democracies. Otherwise, Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Economics laureate, would not have complained. He said, American polity has become of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%.
That's quite a checklist of liberal democratic failures there.
But what's interesting about the clip is it's not a critique of liberal democracy. It's a critique of the state of liberal democracy in some parts of the world. And that I would agree with. And I actually think he's right that the biggest thorn in the side of contemporary liberal democracies is economic inequality. And it's another form of history returning. For me, it was the most interesting part of writing this book was, as someone who studies professionally international relations, to come full circle. Because during the Cold War, there was a focus on the United States against Russia in the world out there. But there were also some shrewd thinkers in the United States, such as George Kennan, who I quote, who said, we won't win this struggle if we don't address the cracks in our own system. And what has started out as a small crack has exploded into extreme inequality. And if liberal democracy is based on the idea of fairness, which I fundamentally believe it is, then what we're seeing in some of the leading liberal democracies, and also we're seeing in China, by the way, the inequality within China, despite the massive lifting of people out of poverty, is also worrying. So he's right to point to how economic inequality erodes the functioning of institutions in very tangible ways.
It does help explain Trumpism, Brexit. Some people have even suggested here in the province of Ontario, it explains why 63% of the province's doctors opted to reject a tentative agreement between the Ontario Medical Association and the Ontario government. There's something out there about sticking it to them these days. And I guess, let me give you a couple other examples here. In Polish schools, apparently, patriotic education is supposed to replace gender studies. So-called gay propaganda is a crime in Russia. How would you compare the impact of the rising wealth gap to the deepening culture gap?
Interesting question. I think you're correct to say that they're both at work, and there is a common underpinning, at least I think in the discourse of populist politicians, which is the nostalgia for the good old days. When things were simpler, when the population was homogeneous, where everyone was well off, and somehow we need to find a way to get back to that. In some of the discourse, it's about take back control. And you think about that phrase. Who doesn't want to take back control? I mean, this is a human emotion, a human desire.
But again, take back suggests you had it in the first place.
Absolutely, yes.
Some did, some didn't.
Yes, but I think now the idea that you can take back control from the experts,
The elites.
the trope in Brexit that was most interesting was, let's stop listening to the experts. The people are tired of the experts. It's take back control from international institutions. It's take back control from the wealthy, the 1%. And that gets to the heart of ideas that underpin democracy, because democracy isn't just about equal participation. There's the other side of the second form of equality, that all voices are heard. And there's been really good political science literature in the last decade that shows in the United States there's systematic development of public policy that privileges certain economic segments. And that, our Chinese colleague is right to condemn. That's what liberal Democrats need to take much more seriously.
It's a really fascinating thing for people who do what you and I do for a living about understanding why Donald Trump is so popular these days. I mean, that line at his convention about "I am your voice." I mean, for a lot of people who think they've been getting screwed for the last 25 years, it's not hard to see why they would see him as their voice. Is that fair to say?
Well, fair.
You may not. Okay, maybe fair is the wrong adjective, but you get it.
I do, and I think what's so troubling about that development is the way in which our existing representative institutions couldn't accommodate that dissent. And so you have, at least in the United Kingdom, where I watched the Brexit vote, a disparaging of Parliament, a belief that referenda should now decide all things. And that is also very deeply troubling, because part of the reason liberal democracy rose and became stronger over 2 centuries was through political institutions that were nurtured. And as we know, the early liberal democracies were not at all universal. People without property couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, but gradually those institutions became shared by all. But when you begin through your dissent to say that those institutions can no longer speak for me, I think we are in a point where liberal democracy needs to sit up and really evaluate where leadership is needed.
A couple of minutes left here, and I want to touch on 2 more things if I can. At the end of the day, what do you think it is that liberal democracies need to do to cope with all of the challenges we've been talking about that are facing them right now?
One of the key pieces is public education. Telling populations, arguing the case for why certain decisions need to be made, or why we need to rethink these issues. Why should we care about the war in Syria? Why should we care about state failure in other parts of the world?
This feels like a fact-free time, though, now,
It does.
Facts have never been less relevant in competing for ideas.
But it needs to be resisted, and it needs to be countered through whatever creative media that we can. And the second aspect of this is for liberal democratic states, along with others, to find the will to act collectively. I mean, let's look at the refugee crisis. The only way we can begin to address it is through a more equitable form of burden sharing. Everyone focuses on that part of the Refugee Convention that's about non-refoulement, not sending people back. But at the heart of the convention was also the notion that the burden is shared. And the frontline states, who today receive the highest number of refugees and asylum seekers, none of them are Western. We paint this problem as being all about what's happening in Europe and the United States and Canada, but those on the front line are not Western states.
And just finally, I know you live over there, but you're from over here. Does this country have anything unique or particular to offer in this debate?
I think we do. I think we need to be careful, as a couple of your clips suggested, about pronouncing that everything we do can be replicated. But I do think the 2 key features that have made Canada work, the first is social mobility, which has come about through progressive public policy, and an ability thus far to cope with and nurture pluralism, are very, very important beacons in a time like this. But we mustn't claim that we have some magic secret. We must instead try and bring to the discussion examples of what we've been able to do.
We're usually pretty good at that.
I hope so, and I hope we can continue to be.
The return of history, conflict, migration, and geopolitics in the 21st century. Jennifer Welsh, it's great to finally have you here at TVO. Thanks so much for visiting us here
discussion.
tonight. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.